Which technologies actually pay off for ranchers? Let's find out. Hey, I'm Shaye Wanner, and you are listening to the Casual Cattle Conversations podcast. Today, we are going to be visiting with Chelsea Good and Jared Wareham, and they both have unique, well-rounded perspectives across agriculture, but specifically in the beef space and with ag technology. So what we're going to do is we're going to deep dive into many technologies, some of the use cases they have, and some of the challenges there are to help you as the rancher wade through where you should start with technology and if maybe you should step to the side and look at something else, or maybe nothing at all, depending on your operation and what you're already doing. So it's a very informative conversation. It's a unique one to the show because we cover so much. So grab a cup of coffee or a bottle of water and enjoy the conversation. I know I really did. All right. Well, Chelsea, welcome to the podcast. And Jared, welcome back. 6 years later, we think. I am excited to have both of you on today because this topic, while I cover a lot of technology on the show, this is going to be a new perspective, and each of you have unique perspectives on the topic itself. So I think we're really going to cover a lot of ground and create some valuable conversations and questions for ranchers. Before we dive into that, I would briefly like each of you to share with listeners today what your role is in the ag tech space. So Chelsea, let's start with you.
Sure. Thanks, Shaye, for having me. Chelsea Good. I'm the owner of Good & Associates, a consulting firm I launched almost a year ago, last July, and I kind of have 4 core services that I provide only to ag and livestock companies, but government affairs, I am a federal and state lobbyist, communications, strategic comms, industry affairs, which that's where ag tech comes in, and then I'm also an attorney. So I found some of the industry affairs needs is honestly companies that think they have a great solution for animal agriculture, but they're not necessarily from the industry, and so they need help figuring out, are they actually a solution to a problem that animal ag is asking to be fixed? And if they are they talking about it in a way in which producers and feedlot operators and packers will actually listen and engage with them? And then some of my relationships there, and a lot of them actually Jared and I do in partnership, are just kind of coaching through those things. And then if a company proves up that, I think they really do have a lot of value to add and it would be mutually beneficial, I've got a lot of relationships throughout the cattle supply chain. And so that is part of how I work with some companies as well, is just introducing them around and helping make the connections with folks that might be able to provide funding or maybe even an opportunity to do some on-site testing, things like that.
All right. Jared, how about you?
So I am the owner CEO of my own company as well. Chelsea and I kind of walked that path together, starting our own businesses a year ago, year plus for myself. My business is Horizon Venture Management. I've kind of got 2 buckets. Do a lot of strategic commercial initiatives up and down the supply chain, primarily in the beef space, beef dairy space, for businesses like, the American Charolais Association would be a client, and others like that. So I spent the first 2/3 to 3/4 of my career in the startup ecosystem. So I'm comfortable there, building up companies from scratch, being a CEO that wears all the hats. So doing some coaching and mentoring is something I feel I have a skill set to do, and I actually really enjoy it. I also kind of sit at that intersection, I guess, the way I look at it and the way we've positioned, I think Chelsea and I both, which is why we work so well together, is we kind of sit at that intersection of agriculture, technology, and venture capital. I think there's a lot of opportunity to make a positive impact for all 3 of those buckets. Obviously, we're very passionate about agriculture, beef being an equine in the specific spaces, but we want to make sure we can help make a positive impact, because we can't have venture capital go away, because then opportunities for new founders to grow businesses would be diminished and vice versa. And so we feel that we have a lot of opportunity to serve all 3 of those pillars.
So Chelsea, you brought something up that Jared and I have also discussed in the past, and that's with some startup companies. They might come out with something really cool, but is it actually a problem that their target audience was actually needing solved. Today we're going to talk about cow-calf producers. And that's where my main question I want to base this conversation around is, how can cow-calf producers really determine which technologies are going to be right for them? I don't care who kind of dives into that first, but I'd just like to bring light to that challenge itself in the ag space.
I might give an example of an experience I have that maybe isn't necessarily a value add, and then turn it over to Jared, because I know he's worked with some companies and has some ideas about where things actually are a fit. I spent 12 and a half years at Livestock Marketing Association, led their government and industry affairs, so represented the local livestock auctions across the United States. And I can't tell you how many tag companies came to us and said, we've got this great new tag, and not only does it trace animals, but it also does all these additional value-added things, and surely your sale barns, and the producers they work with want these tags. And it's like, well, a sale barn is selling livestock for a very small commission, either a percentage or per head fee. Your technology is more expensive than what they're making per animal. That's not a fit, right? And that's kind of an example of maybe a mismatch. On the other hand, Where Food comes from is a company I work with today, and they do a lot of value add traceability, and their real foundation is, yes, they're tagged and they're traceable, but they're tagged to prove up something that people are willing to spend more money on, whether that's a non-hormone treated calf, or if it's care certified, so you know a little bit more about the animal handling practices. If you watch those video auctions, Superior, and you see, all of the bells and whistles and different things that different animals have in terms of certifications, you can see a difference in terms of what buyers are willing to spend on those animals. And so that's why a producer is going to do something, not necessarily because it's cool to know what the temperature of an animal is at any given moment, but it's because they're going to get paid to do so, or it makes some business sense for them. Jared, what are your thoughts?
No, I agree. And I thought the point you made earlier when we first were doing introductions, that there's a lot of technology that I'd say the vast majority of it enters our market and our space from external sources, which is great. We have to have new blood and new life come into our industry to bring these new technologies, but a lot of them enter our space looking for a problem to solve. And they don't necessarily come into the space first and say, hey, what is the biggest problems that exist? How can I go about solving them? And so I think, to your point, there are a lot of technologies that are neat and novel and can give us a lot of cool options, right? And we have to really break down what the ROI is of that, unless you just really, if you feel comfortable and you're emotionally excited about having technology and integrating it because you feel it's what you need to do, and it's a stewardship related issue or just a sustainable production related issue, and it's not directly tied to what's the most profitable form of ranching, then by all means have fun with it, invest in those technologies and integrate them. But if you're operating like most of us in the agricultural system, which you're asset rich and cash poor, right? Everything has to have an ROI, and we have lots of pain points that need to be solved. The challenge is a lot of the technology to solve those pain points cost, as you said, a lot more than what they're going to have to even have a sustainable ROI and integrate. And so I think that's where we have to start the conversations there. And then from that standpoint, I think there are technologies that are out there today that are really, really, really awesome. I think Chelsea and I both come in contact with quite a few of them. And they have a place here or a place there, and we can get into that for sure. I would love to. But I think the one thing that I try to think about, talk about, and stress when I communicate with those in the industry about technology and integrating something, or even something as novel as change management. These are tools that we have that we put in something like a tool belt that you wear to work every day. You wouldn't take a claw hammer and use it for every single job you have on the ranch or every single job you would have to build a house. You have different tools, and you would use the appropriate tool for the appropriate job and the appropriate amount. And you may want to get a brand new claw hammer that's technologically advanced, but perhaps that claw hammer doesn't have an ROI that justifies the old existing tool that already works good enough. And so I think we have to really break it down to that before we move forward and have those conversations about what out there do we see works, how is it working, who gets along with it the best. So I think that's a great way to kind of frame it up from my standpoint.
Jared, that analogy I love. There's that old saying, to a hammer, everything looks like a nail, right? And I think that some of what I see coming from outside ag is it's maybe somebody who really understands artificial intelligence really well, is not from the cattle sector, thinks being a cowboy would be cool, or met somebody from the cattle sector once. And so they show up and like they've got a hammer and they think it solves everything in animal ag because that's the tool they brought. They didn't bring a whole toolbox with different things, and they didn't show up first, to have conversations about what your needs are to figure out, okay, could this hammer maybe fix one of those needs? It's just like, they're all nails. We're going to fix everything with this thing I know about from outside the industry.
I think you hit the nail on the head, all pun intended there, but I think specifically with AI, I think that's exactly what's happening right now. It's very much a shotgun, or we're going to hammer every nail instead of the scalpel approach. And trust me, AI is going to change our industry. It already is in certain ways. It's an important tool, but it is not a fix-all for every situation.
Well, and even from my experience from internships and being a rancher myself, people from outside the industry may create these tools and think it's going to work for every rancher. And we all know that's not the case, because I look at some technologies. I'm going to use heat detection technologies. I can see that working very well for seed stock operations, other people who are doing intense AIing, things along those lines. For my husband and I, who are not set up for that right now, there could be some bonuses if they were already a part of a tag that we were using for something else. But if we're only using natural service for us just to get something for heat detection, that doesn't make sense. And so every ranch is different. So the priorities of which technology goes where, what to invest in, is not the same across the board. But not all companies recognize that.
That kind of segues perfectly into something, Shaye, you and I talked about last week as we were visiting about doing this podcast, which is the genomic space and some of those things. So I want to start off by saying I am a firm believer in genetics and genomics and the use of those tools to make progress, and I think we've definitely proven as an industry that we've been able to do that, both beef and dairy. I mean, clearly the dairy industry has outpaced us with some of these tools. Real quick, to revert back, my AI I was referring to before was artificial intelligence, and right now artificial insemination. So we have to, I think, sometimes clarify how we're using that now. But I think genomics is a tool that we try to fit into that box. I want to be very clear again that I'm a believer in it, and I appreciate that technology. But I think sometimes we try to put it into that this hammer's going to smack every nail on the head and solve every problem. And sometimes I think we are guilty of maybe not looking at some of the lower hanging fruit. And hey, if you're a commercial operation, can you deploy genomics testing to help you in certain ways? Absolutely. Is it something that you need to do every year for every? I don't know. I don't know what every ranch's ROI would be on that. If you're a ranch that's going to acquire another ranch and you're going to get with it the cattle that are occupying that ranch, they come in the deal, and you wanted to get a really good idea of what you just purchased, absolutely. DNA test every single one of them and get a really good snapshot of where you are, especially if you feed your own cattle, especially if you market intensively by using your genetics as part of the marketing program, wherever you're selling those cattle. So if you're buying genetics from seed stock producers that do everything they can to make sure that the genetics are as elite as possible, then I think the pull through that you'll get from buying those genetics from said seed stock producer is probably the maximum amount of value you can extrapolate from some of those technologies. I'm not saying you should never use them for anything else, but that's the biggest bang for your buck. So that decision of who you do business with, I think, is the most important decision you make with regard to those technologies.
Shaye, I think your example is perfect. Your average cow-calf producer, let's say maybe an investment like a herd dog tag might be too much per head, but I was on an operation in South Dakota the other day that put the tags in just right before they do their cedar work, and it helped them detect heat on a third of one set of heifers right before they were going to do cedars. Well, that made a huge difference for them, right? Because then they did natural breeding there, and they would have had a much worse conception rate than they were expecting had they not utilized that technology. But that's a very specific type of an operation. So I think that it takes, thinking about, does this fit for me? Jared and I, we've got a friend in common in Oklahoma who's a stalker guy who we've been talking about virtual fencing with, who's like, that makes no sense to me, right? In Oklahoma on stalkers, why wouldn't we just use a regular fence? And so Jared had to have a conversation about Okay, let's talk about different operations that utilize public land or much more rugged landscape and how different that looks than what you see day to day.
Yeah, we dove right into that conversation. And of course, he was unaware of the fact that a lot of ranches that run up in the forest have to constantly repair fences from snow or from elk or other kinds of wildlife. So replacing that infrastructure with a collar does have an ROI in certain situations. I think you'd have to pencil that yourself to really determine what number of head and what number of acres and how much fencing costs in that area. The quarter mile of fence is different region to region. It's all gotten expensive, but it still varies. And I could see, especially where he's operating and grazing some of that really, really high quality native grass, it's very hard to put the stocking densities high enough because you destroy some of the biomass and you have maybe more of a negative effect on the land from a stewardship standpoint than you would in an alternative location. Let's say if you're in a fescue belt and you can be harder on that grass, I think you could probably find ways like they do in New Zealand to utilize those collars to load up and get a lot of animals in a small amount of acreage and make that work. It really just depends. Again, geography matters in this situation.
Absolutely. And virtual fence is a big one that's been on the show from different companies even. And there are a lot of use cases, but Jared, like you said, you've really got to sit down and pencil it out and see how it works for you. I mean, my husband and I talk about it with our rented pasture. The perimeter fence is not great, so that needs to be replaced anyways. But we're talking to the landowner about, well, that needs to be replaced. And really, if you want us to take care of this, it's a whole quarter. Like, it needs to be cross-fenced and some of those things too. And there might be a use case for virtual fence there, but is that our only place to use it? And because if so, it might not pay off. But if we can use it for the majority of the year or the entire year, that's going to pay off better. So there's a lot to think about there. Chelsea, you've brought up tags a couple times just from your past role, and then you brought up the herd dog tag. And again, I've had a few tag companies on the show too, and they're doing some really neat stuff that for some producers is working really well. So we've already talked about heat detection as one of the features. Some of them have the GPS, your regular, some other biometrics. You kind of talked about health and wellness in the marketing space a little bit. Let's kind of dive into some of those other features commonly offered by these tags. Let's start with the GPS portion so we can track those individual animals.
Yeah, or I might even take it a step back where most producers tag their cattle, right? But usually it's a no technology tag. It's a plastic tag, but that is kind of a time-honored way to keep track of animals individually. Branding, obviously, is a great form of herd identification in some states, depending on state law, a great way to ensure that title. But tags are something most producers utilize on their own operations and figure out what works for them. As we look at RFID as kind of maybe that next step, those low frequency RFID tags feel like they've gotten a lot of uptick in different programs, and a pretty common next step as it relates to, okay, now instead of reading a number by hand and inputting it in, I'll have something that I can wand or take by a reader that it has a pretty close visual line of sight. I've seen some excitement in the livestock auction space on ultra high frequency RFID. If you live in a state where you have a toll system that you put something in your vehicle and then when you drive through a toll booth, you can go fast and it just charges you, that's probably UHF RFID. And there's all sorts of other use cases for UHF RFID. US Cattle Trace kind of started as a pilot project. It might have been almost 10 years ago now, maybe a few less than that, just to test, can we do true traceability throughout all of the sectors of the cattle chain at speed of commerce? And I think that the answer they came up with was yes, that they can get sightings of dated UHF, for the most part, RFID, throughout the chain and be able to tell where that animal has been at all of the different places that do a sighting. I think that that is good quality information to have. I've got some battle scars as it relates to whether or not tagging should be mandatory, and I don't think that that's what this conversation is about, but I think that that often confuses the issue, and that's not what I want to talk about today. I think I just want to talk about what technologies are out there that are options for producers who choose to use those options. And I think that traceability is such a big conversation. It's a big conversation in all proteins, especially as animal health is super important, but I think it's a much more complicated conversation in the cattle sector because our ownership structure is different, right? While there are many people that retain ownership throughout, we still have the majority of the cattle that move through the chain that probably started a cow-calf producer, might get sold, and a stalker might spend some time with them, could get sold again to a feed yard, and then sold again to a packer. So you've got these different owners throughout, and in my mind, one of the true challenges with traceability is who bears the expense and who gets the benefit of the traceability when you've got different owners throughout the lifetime. There's a lot of producers that want more information about their genetics and how their animals perform in a feed yard or perform on the rail. Is there a good way to pass that information back? And how do we make sure that the incentives are in place, right? And so I think those are still some of the fundamental questions we wrestle with as we think about traceability and the use cases. But I think in my mind, that's the most basic use case is keeping track of animals, keeping track of health and genetics, and ideally finding some way to figure out how those animals perform to give information back to producers to help them make good decisions. I took that a little bit at maybe a more basic level, but I think that that's probably, in my mind, a starting place. Maybe one of the two of you want to jump in terms of all the things you can layer on. You know, if you've got the GPS, then suddenly like you can pull up on your phone or your iPad and you can see where those animals are, right? And I've seen producers do that and think that that is really cool. Some of them I feel like are doing that just because they're people that have a town job or travel a lot and they just enjoy that and want that information. Kind of the same reason they put cameras all over, that they just want to stay connected. And then I see other people do that for more business purposes and business reasons, that it actually is something that pencils out in the operation.
Yeah, I think some of the ways to build on what Chelsea said, that I'm aware that some of these technologies, especially like GPS tags, are coming in handy. I know a lot of ranches in my part of the country, I mean big country out here, Colorado, Wyoming, Montana, Utah, Nevada, et cetera, and other places like that. Bulls are expensive. I mean, what are they averaging, 15, 16,000 now? More in the western states or the high plains. And so being able to know where they're at all times, that's a big business expense that depreciates rapidly, right? If we can put a GPS tag in our herd bulls when we turn those cows up into the forest, and if we can have some ability to understand how often they're moving, hey, they're not with the cows, he hasn't moved in 2 days, there's a problem, he's taking longer to go to water than everybody else, we may want to go check on this individual. I can see some real application there. Do you need to put a tag in every cow? Again, check your ROI and see if that pencils. Can you strategically use those types of tags with something like your herd bulls? I do like what Chip's doing with 701X and really diving into that seed stock space. Again, who you buy bulls from and all the things they do to provide service to you as a ranch matters. And if they're going the extra mile to put in a GPS tag so that you can take advantage of the benefit of having that when you buy those bulls, that makes sense, right? That's something I think a ranch can really wrap their head around and get on board with. Again, the estrus-detection makes perfect sense. Just to circle back into it, because we're right there on the cusp of hopefully having, if we can get through this massive drought that it seems like we're in again, hopefully if we get to that super El Nino pattern and we get wet for several years, we're going to have herd expansion. There's going to be a lot of heifers retained. So whether those heifers are retained in a feedlot setting on grass, being able to detect estrus, I think is going to have some real value as we're trying to rebuild the cow herd with commercial use of artificial insemination. And then again, it makes perfect sense in the seed stock space. As far as health and biometrics, I still think we're figuring that one out. I think there's plenty of good stuff going on in that space. Obviously, Merck has their Sense Hub products, Herd Dog we talked about. I think everybody can make the case that we can discover something that we never used to be able to discover, but how consistently can we discover it? And were those animals that would have already gotten sick anyways? I think that's the big question mark. Would we have discovered the illness? Would we have treated them? Are we retreating them too many times because of that? That's a big one. I think Chelsea actually had great conversations with a company in the pork space called X-Sites that has a very interesting biometric tag that is synced through to Bluetooth to a vaccination gun. And as somebody goes through a pen or a house, whether it's a farrowing facility or a growing facility, if an animal's sick, has been treated, it logs it. And so the next person that goes through on the next shift will know, hey, this animal's been treated or has not. I mean, I could see that in a calf ranch scenario, perfectly adaptable to help reduce. And then we have conversations. We were just locked in one yesterday, Chelsea, right, about antimicrobial resistance and trying to use antibiotics in a proper managed way, right? We can't let our animals get sick and die, but at the same time, we do know there are ramifications by overuse of it. So later in their life, when they're in the feed yard, they don't respond. So how do we better track some of those things? So these are kind of the neat tag things I think that are out there. They may not work wholesale across the board for everybody, but I would encourage a lot of the ranchers out there to look into it because bulls are darn expensive. High conception rates on heifer programs. If you're deciding that one day you're going to jump into this rebuild and you want to start making commercial bred heifers, perhaps that's a way to get a better conception rate.
One of the things about that X-Sites tag I really love, Jared, is the fact that it can light up. And so, like, you can go into a hog facility and, like, anything that's got a fever or hasn't been to water in a certain period of time, it'll, like, light up red, and that helps you identify those animals even easier. I thought that was really cool.
One tag we didn't talk about was the series tag. One of their unique features is measuring that forage intake when animals are out grazing. And that's a unique one that they're finding is incredibly interesting, going back to the research that not all 1,000-pound cows eat the same if we're looking at that traditional stocking rate or the AUMs that we're looking at. So that's an interesting one for ranchers to look at as well, just to see which cows are actually profitable and fit their environment more so, I should say.
Yeah, that is an interesting one, and you're right to bring them up. I think, again, we are still in a lot of this discovery phase of what we can learn from biometrics and collecting insights through tags, collars, cameras. We haven't even talked about cameras yet, and that's coming. Some of it's already here, but there's a lot of that that's going to be coming. And I think that there is some neat stuff maybe coming. Will we learn about heifer development? Are the heifers you select, if we use a tag like Ceres to understand more about how efficient they are on forage regardless of body mass, will they stay that way their entire life? If they do, then can we capture that information early in life in a breeding program? Also because I believe one of the things that they're working on is heat detection, right? That's so you got multiple options within one tag there. If you can learn all of that, and if we can then use those insights and track them and know that, well, okay, if they are efficient as a 1 to 2 year old animal, they will also be efficient the rest of their lives for the most part, or on average, or at a high rate, then will that be something that we can plug into genetic selection tools? Breed associations can begin using that then impacts maternal selection indexes, etc. So I think we're scratching the surface on what some of these tools can actually help us achieve.
Now, Jared, you brought up cameras, and cameras are being used for a variety of tools right now. So do you want to share some examples there, and we can dive into that technology?
Yeah, I think that's a really, I mean, we're looking at cameras. I mean, there's some that are facial recognition. I think there's a lot of work being done collecting data. And of course, the back end part of the data collection is, okay, we have the whole machine learning, artificial intelligence piece comes into it. What can we collect? Okay, these are the data points that we can accurately collect. All right, we're going to build a data lake. We're going to fill it with those data points, and then we're going to help the machine learn how to analyze that information and look for patterns, and we have to continue to teach it and educate it. Okay, here's the pattern we're seeing, and this is what I want you to look for, and then when the camera sees it, it flags something. I think there's cameras looking at not only monitoring animal consumption, but development, reading bunks. There's some really neat companies working on automated feed trucks that plan to mount LiDAR technology to help the feed truck move around the feed yard, but also deploy cameras to read bunks while it's doing it. I'm aware of some companies that are trying to use drones to fly bunks, and I know we're getting out of the ranching space into the feed yard space, but I think you can understand if we can do these things and deploy that technology in the feed yard, we could probably also deploy it on the ranch, because there are a fair amount of ranches that do have grow yards, and they're going to wean calves, and of course feed efficiency is important. Right now corn's cheap, we can feed more of it than normal, and so how long will it be till we get to a point where it's no longer the price that it is now and the cost of rations goes up? And so really monitoring some of those things that go into cost of gain becomes even more important than it. I mean, it's always important, but when corn jumps to $7 or maybe beyond this next time, we don't know. How can we manage the inputs of our business and be more precise with the decisions we make?
I'd have a couple use cases to add. I mean, I think an obvious one that we're pretty far along with is camera grading of carcasses, right? And I think that that's a great example of how technology can be utilized to reduce the need for humans and actually improve accuracy. Jared and I know folks that have been able to develop applications where you can weigh cattle based on photos and videos. Is it scale accurate? No. Is it much better than a human eye? Yeah. And so I think that there's some uses there. I'm really interested. USDA is working on a pilot project right now where a lot of the data that we get from the market news program is a human that's sitting in sale barns, and they're watching animals sell, and they are collecting obviously price and weight, but they're also doing a frame score on those animals. And then they're in some cases giving them some sort of a classification like thin or fancy or fleshy or something like that. I think cameras can probably do that, right? And when connected with sales systems that are already capturing weight and price, you really need to do the frame and the classification component, and we can have way more data than we currently do, which is really important information because it helps people price animals whether or not they're selling in an auction environment. And it's also the data that gets utilized by the CME to create the feeder cattle index to settle those contracts. And so I think that having a lot of volume and quality of data there is really meaningful, and I'm interested in to see how that pilot that USDA is working on goes.
Chelsea, I'm glad you brought up the weighing technology. As you were saying that, I was actually searching something on my computer to bring that up because, like you said, I can see how, since they've been working on it for quite a while, if it's accurate enough where it's better than the human eye, but like you said, not an actual weight. And that's kind of my beef sometimes with weighing systems. Just growing up, weighing every calf. I don't know how many times we weighed animals going through the chute just to have an actual weight. So that's my thing. I like that actual weight. I don't like the hoof tape. So sometimes the camera thing makes me a little iffy, but I can also see it if you're out in the pasture and you have to treat something. It's better than probably guessing with your eye.
For sure. I think fill, I guess, is really hard for a camera to tell and estimate. That's one of the factors that is really challenging for that machine learning to get its head around, is how full an animal is can make a big difference in that weight. But I do think that there's some potential use cases if you think about like stocker operations, right, where they're probably not going to have a scale there, but they're going to market those animals probably at a certain weight, and there's a slide. The more accurate they can be in weight, the better. And if you've got a group of animals, you can get fairly accurate, especially if you've got a group and you just don't have an individual animal that you're trying to weigh.
I would agree with you, Chelsea. The stalker space seems, to me, one of the most logical spaces for that. If you have thousands of head out on Flint Hill grass somewhere, and you want to know a pretty good estimate of how many pounds a day they're doing, because you've got to market it and you've got a delivery date 80 days out. And if they're not on track, or if they're ahead of track, you have to make adjustments. You're either going to get a group in and spot weigh them, physically do it, or if you have a tool that's 95 to 98% accurate with weighing just by driving down a row of them, by caking them, and then you cake them, you drive past them, take a video. If it can get it that accurate, then I think that has application, right? I think that makes sense if you need to readjust your base weight, you've sold them, or you're getting ready to sell them on a like Superior Livestock, like we mentioned earlier, or Western or Northern or something like that. and you have them on the video and you have them base weighted at 875, and you actually think by delivery time they're going to be closer to 890, then you adjust your base weight prior to sell, etc. I think that has some real application there.
Anything else on cameras? We didn't touch on calving cameras. I feel that one's been around for a while and has a specific use case.
I think we're just getting started there too. I can tell you, I want to get in too deep of specifics there, but I think before long we will have cameras that can detect and anticipate an event. Is it a calving event? Yeah, we can look at a camera today and say, hey, this heifer's calving because we're sitting there in front of the camera watching it. I think whether it's the equine space or other livestock spaces, we'll have cameras that have learned and been trained, this is a cow or this is a heifer that's getting ready to go into labor, and give you a flag warning an hour to 30 minutes or more in advance. This is an animal that's getting ready to have this event or is experiencing this health event because it's watching it and it's learned what to look for. So I think that'll be here faster than we think. The other space, and we didn't really get into this because we've tried to focus mostly on the ranch with our conversation, but I think the space that cameras are impacting more than any other, and that Chelsea kind of called it out, was with the camera grading, is that harvest facility. There are some companies that we've talked to that have some awesome technologies using cameras to measure primals or individual cuts and help the further processing facilities do a better job in trimming those, whether it's a full primal or it's down to the individual steak. It's amazing how much they've improved the efficiency in those plants, just in the small number of plants that are actually starting to integrate those technologies. And those, they go right under a camera analyzes it, and then tells the cutters or the machines that are then doing some of the custom cutting that you'll adjust yourself, this is how you cut it. I've seen some of them in harvest facilities already. It's pretty interesting stuff.
Yeah, I'm going to stay on that for a second. Some of them are actually marketed as a human training tool, right? Like we can use lasers to show cut lines for, a new person that is on the line that doesn't necessarily have that experience. That's a way to start training employees. Or there's a technology that is starting to be put in some plants where you take, a cut under a camera and it identifies the cut and it weighs it and does the shape, and then it keeps going. And then it sorts it into a box based on that, right? And so we can get more consistency in those boxes because it's not just the same cut, but we're putting a narrower weight range, or it not just weight, but just thickness within a certain box. I think that is hopefully going to provide better eating experiences, more consistent eating experiences.
And I think, Chelsea, beyond just the line in the harvest facilities, we know some of those technologies like flow vision is going in some of the butcher shops or the areas that would be taking beef out of the box and then preparing it for the retail case, and helping the hand cutters that are doing some of that preparation make sure they, to your point, make the right cut and become more efficient. So there's actually a company Chelsea and I've kind of talked to several times that we find very interesting. It's called Agrigene, and they're getting into the genetic modification of like flies and other insects, specifically like horn and stable flies, and trying to create a system where you're going to make one part of the population infertile, turn them loose in droves, and then it really reduces that entire population's ability to reproduce themselves. And I think that's especially for all states, but when we look at our Gulf Coast states, places like Florida, Texas, Mississippi, Alabama, places that have a lot of issues with flies, stable flies, horn flies, and biting insects, to me, that's an interesting technology. It's not necessarily new and novel. There's been some things being worked on for 5 or 6 years, but there's a lot of that technology that's really starting to come about. And I know as we've dealt with how are we going to respond to New World screwworm once it gets here, and I saw the drovers post yesterday saying it was 52 miles from the border now. And so we assume at some point we will have to deal with this. I think there's some of those technologies with biting insects that are very interesting when you look at creating modified organisms that'll go out, not be able to reproduce, or however they have that system created for that technology to defeat the ability of, whether it's New World screwworm or whatever species they're trying to limit the impact of, defeat their ability to reproduce themselves. There's some really neat stuff going on in that space, and I think that directly impacts the ranch for sure.
I would totally agree. I mean, the ability to create male-only already sterile flies, which is what Agrigene can do with that gene edited technology, That takes out two components of the major tool that we have in fighting New World screwworm. Two components that are expensive and kind of time consuming. It could make us a lot better. I know that they have a New World screwworm Grand Challenge application, and I'm hoping that that's one that USDA chooses to fund, because in my mind, that's exactly the type of kind of novel technology that we need to be looking at as we, as an industry, figure out how we are going to deal with that challenge, because that challenge is not going away. And candidly, just because the border is currently closed to feeder cattle import does not mean that we are not still running a risk of New World screwworm in the United States. There's a lot of wildlife that still crosses that border. There's a lot of trucks that still cross that border. I do not think that we have a foolproof system there, and people recognize that. I think that we're just trying to delay the time it takes to maybe get here, but it's also created a really negative, from my just personal perspective, side effect to our cattle industry, where we are at really low cow numbers. We just took 1.2 million head of cattle a year that are usually imported, fed out here in the United States. Suddenly those are no longer on the table. That's been challenging.
And we may be changing our industry completely for the future with regards to that situation there along the border. I mean, a lot of feeding infrastructure has gone in Mexico the last 18 to 24 months. If the border doesn't open, even if it does open, I think they figured out that they can put in feeding infrastructure and they can feed those cattle in Mexico instead of sell them into the U.S. And maybe 1% of them always will come north. We do need those numbers. They're a big part of what we do here as far as food production in the U.S. A lot of them go to California, get grazed for a year and roped and used in cutting events. I tell you, there's a massive industry out there that revolves around the Mexican steers that come across that border when it comes to not only our beef and our food industry, but steers for roping calves, cutting, rain cow horse. All of those industries depend on a lot of those cattle. And it's interesting to see the impact of that closed border has changed things. And there'll be positive things that come about and negative, right? The law of unintended consequences always shows up at some point. And I think the feeding infrastructure that's going in south of the border is something that we should probably keep an eye on, because it could impact our production systems into the future.
I 100% agree, Jared. I mean, we are already importing more beef from Mexico than ever before, and we don't have the ability to add value to that here in the United States in the same way as if it's imported as feeder cattle. But it's not just the feeding infrastructure, it's the packing infrastructure as well, that hopefully we're not too late, but I think that we need to seriously figure out ways to safely import feeder cattle soon in order to avoid a fundamental shift there. I do have one other comment. We started this talking about agrogene, right, and gene-edited flies. So PIC is a client. They have the first FDA-approved gene-edited hog that is PRRS resistant. I think that is absolutely fascinating technology. And they're being strategic about making sure that they get approvals in some other countries as well, places like Mexico and Japan, prior to taking that to market. But I don't think that that technology is just about the PRRS-resistant pig, which is huge. I mean, last year was the worst year for PRRS ever, and this year is going to be worse. It is absolutely the right animal health, animal welfare thing to do to implement this technology. But I also think that there's all sorts of other use cases that could come along in hogs, poultry, cattle, if we're able to make sure we do this in a way that we maintain that consumer trust and acceptance. And I think we can. Gene-edited technology is something I'm really excited about for lots of different use cases.
Folks, are you ready for more conversations to push your ranch to the next level and keep you thinking about how you can improve as a ranch manager? If you're thinking, heck yeah, then you need to join my free Facebook group, Rising Ranchers, where you can connect and learn from other ranchers and experts, as well as access additional ranching resources. You can find the direct link in the show notes. Well, I feel kind of weird making this transition, going from gene editing to the one thing on the list we haven't talked about, which is some of those record-keeping technologies. But I think going back to that basic level is also important, because, Chelsea, when we started with the tags, you took it back a notch and talked about the basics of some of those too. So what do you guys have to say, or what are you seeing with some of these digital record-keeping platforms that are becoming more common and out there today?
I think we can all agree that keeping accurate records is one way to utilize information to make good decisions, right? I have a hard time making any kind of important decisions when I don't have any information or insights to drive my decision-making process. I'm going to tell a story backwards, and I'm going to try to do it as fast as possible. Most of these companies, not all, but a lot of them have come from outside the country. And it's not a bad thing. They have great technology. They do. They have a great product. But they come from places like the UK and the EU. So want to make sure everybody understands I'm not being negative here. I'm just saying there is a different environment in those countries where policy has really driven the integration of software and things that are related to supply chain traceability, etc. So producers in those countries have to use these products to continue to be involved in agriculture. That is not the case here. So I think like a lot of the companies that started down this path entered the U.S. market, seeing this massive market, 30 million cows and all these cattle on feed, and they're like, holy smokes, we're going to, specifically to the cow-calf space, no bad days from here on, right? Because we've got so many cows, so many ranches to work with. But the problem is we don't have policy driving integration. There are varying levels of information usage on ranches. I'm trying to be very, sensitive to how I talk about this, because it goes to show you one of the most popular things at trade shows today are still those little mini record books that people write birth weights and birth dates in. It's a valuable tool, and we still use it as kind of a state-of-the-art tool. We have not gotten to the point where we believe that is outdated technology. And it's hard for some people to get their minds around that come from the technology and software space. Do I think they have value? Again, it's all going to depend on the individual operation, other things involved in marketing decisions, production decisions, etc. I think a lot of those companies, I would tell them this and have told several of them this, that although they have a solution to something, they're still not solving a pain. They have not solved any problem that readily exists and is recognized as a pain point by most of our commercial space, not the seed stock space. Most seed stock producers have had to collect data, and these programs make perfect sense because we have to collect those data points to then improve, etc. I think maybe they're missing in certain ways, and they don't quite understand our production spaces and what really matters to the rancher. So with that being said, do I think they have value? Yes. Do I think if you're not using one, you're making a mistake? Not necessarily. If the record book that you have on the dash of your truck or in the cubby hole that you still write all that information down is there, you take it in the house, you have your records, and you're not necessarily getting paid for having all that information piled away. To your point earlier, Chelsea, when we market those calves, then that's a tough decision to say you need to be doing this.
This kind of circles us back to where we started of like, are you solving a problem that producers are asking to be solved, right? I think there's a lot of producers that are fairly comfortable with whatever the record keeping system they have already is, and it could be those record books that you keep in your shirt pocket. It could be an Excel spreadsheet you develop, but there's a lot of operations that have figured out a way to capture the information that they think they need. And my challenge to those companies would be, how are you doing this differently, better, more efficiently, in ways that add value to that operation, by saving them time, by finding ways that they can get more new information and make money off of that more new information. I think it circles back to kind of where we started. The other example I wanted to give, because I spent so long in the livestock marketing space, right? And I'm born and bred in the cattle industry, come from a cow-calf family, and my dad's a livestock market analyst. I had no idea prior to working for LMA how many millions of dollars of cattle hit the road every day without the money having already changed hands. That checks in the mail is still the standard for paying for livestock in our industry, right? And being an attorney, I've seen some of those things go wrong and some of the risks there. But at the end of the day, I have had so many companies approach me and say, hey, we can do this on blockchain. We can do this on Bitcoin. We can digitize this. We can make this quicker. And it goes back to that fundamental question of, are you solving a problem that's asking to be solved? Or take it a step further, are you actually solving a problem some people don't want to be solved? Is float part of the way, some people that are doing cattle transactions at a large volume, it helps them be as big as they are because of the way that they manage the money. And if that's the case, it's going to be hard to really catch wind with something that fundamentally shifts the speed of the transaction. And those are interesting conversations to have with inventors because their assumption is just faster is going to be better and more secure. And while there are some value propositions there, I also think that you need to keep in mind, what is this industry? What is the heritage? What is the standard? And if you're going to be a bull in a china closet, are you breaking any fine china that can't be put back together, right? And those are always really interesting conversations to have and kind of leveling for a lot of companies. Jared and I have had to have tough conversations with people about, hey, your technology is very interesting and it looks like it says it can do what you want it to do. I'm not sure anybody's asking for that, and I'm pretty positive nobody's asking to pay for that.
Yeah, you hit on a good one, Chelsea. We've had a handful of discussions on that topic, and you're spot on. It depends on who you are in that supply chain as to why you would want to move things faster. And then there's a lot of banks or financial organizations that are already doing free ACHs, which would be automated clearinghouse transactions. So if they're getting their transactions for free and they can do that within 24 to 48 hours, why would they pay you to be a clearinghouse as well? And of course, we don't have time to go in all the depths and that, but there are some things that, might make sense, but that's a solution in search of a problem to solve.
Can I be an awkward attorney for a minute? Jared and I do enough together that he's like, that's not actually a question. Chelsea's going to do what she wants. One issue I have with ACHs is that you can't joint an ACH the way you joint a check, right? And so a lot of times if you sell livestock at an auction, they should be taking a look at the lien list. And if Chelsea sells livestock, I have a lien on all after acquired livestock. And so my check should be made out to both Chelsea Good and my farm credit, right? There's not a way to do that with ACH. And so I think that that is a challenge that we need to work with from a banking infrastructure, potentially even legislative component, to make sure that we are allowing some of those tools that do exist to be utilized in the industry in a way that doesn't create some unintended consequences or allows people to use those in a way that still protects them as it relates to liens and things like that.
Thank you for being an awkward attorney. I wouldn't call that an awkward attorney. I did not know that. So thank you for bringing that up. That's an interesting point. Chelsea and Jared, I think the three of us could go on and talk all day about this topic and dive into even more sectors of the industry and even span into agriculture as a whole if we wanted to. But as we wrap up, my final question for you: if ranchers out there are listening to this, what's one thing you want them to remember about this conversation?
I think my one thing is, honestly, we're a little critical of companies for not necessarily having the right market fit. I think that that's on us as an industry, right? That we need to be having back and forth conversations, and we need to be sharing, where are our pain points? Where are there places on your operation where you could see technology making a difference? And sometimes it takes creating relationships. Sometimes it takes welcoming people into your operation that you wouldn't typically, but to help them have that hands-on experience of like, oh, I understand now what they're saying, why like this is such a challenging thing for this operation because I'm seeing it firsthand and I'm experiencing it. And so that would be my call out to producers: is we can't just point fingers at companies and ag tech here. I think we have to welcome them onto our operations and welcome them into conversation about where are there areas that we do think that technology can make a difference and we would be willing to invest.
You're right, Chelsea. We've been somewhat antagonistic, but also positive about ag tech in general because we see so much of it, so we have those perspectives. But I think, to echo what you said, take it to a little different direction, that I think if I was sitting in their shoes, and I have to some degree, I had my own cow herd for 23 years and did my best to integrate technologies, started basically on my own and did not have the cash flow to do a lot of things from a technology standpoint or do a lot of the things that were traditional. So I had to look outside the box for opportunities to integrate tools, rotational grazing, mob grazing, all those things were things I could use and it really didn't cost anything, and it enhanced my ability to be productive. But from a standpoint of enabling and creating a sustained next generation in the program, if I was a rancher or a ranching outfit, because most of them are families and we all have to work together in those scenarios, I would think having regular conversations of, okay, what technologies are out there, what technologies can we explore and slowly integrate so that we maintain a level of economic sustainability so that the next generation can come back and take this on. You can't not look at any of it. You have to explore what is the technology that's going to bridge the gap between this generation and the next. And that's, to me, the most important thing from the ranch's standpoint. Who do I talk to? What technologies are out there? I think Chelsea and I are individuals that can help with things like that. But if I was sitting in those shoes, it'd be all right. If I'm going to do X, Y, and Z, and I got to be better at running in the forest, and I got to maintain these forest permits, and right now I'm dealing with that, but I'm battling the fact that our water shortage is here and all these other things. And so do I look at technologies that can help my oncoming generation that we want to pass this off to, put them in a position to be less in that cash poor, asset rich scenario and more proactive and using insights to run it more like a business. That's what my recommendation would be.
Well, thank you both for being on the show today. This was a really fun conversation for me to have because we weren't just focused in on one company or one piece of technology. We really covered a broad spectrum. So thank you.
Thanks for having us. I enjoyed it.
Absolutely, Shaye. If you get feedback on this episode and there's something we touched on that everybody wants to do a deep dive on, we'd love to come back and we could spend however long you wanted to just peeling that onion and talking more in depth about whatever that would be.
Absolutely. And listeners, if you want to give me that feedback, those of you on social media, message me there or go to my website and hit the contact us form, and that goes straight to my email so you can connect with me. Now, if you want to connect with Chelsea and Jared, I'll include links to their websites in the descriptions. And I really hope you take the time to give feedback to at least one of us after you have this conversation and do what both of them said and just think about what's going to impact your operation and what direction are you going. Remember, the best way to support this podcast and all your other favorite podcasts is to leave a rating or review, and better yet, share it with a friend who's going to find this information valuable, because podcasts still grow best by word of mouth. With that, happy ranching.